Fur-Fect Mate. A Shapeshifter series written by Sweet Pea. His Baby to Bear Chapter 1. The echo of her footsteps seemed to chase her down like a pack of ferocious hounds. Olivia kept looking over her shoulder every few steps, her breath catching in her throat. She had the distinct impression that she was being followed. The streets, on the other hand, were practically deserted. The Laguna sky was gloomy, lit only by artificial lights and a sliver of the old moon, which was gradually fading into obscurity. Olivia could tell she was sobbing because her hasty footsteps were accompanied by hiccuping noises every now and then. "Get home," she chanted to herself, her hands clasped together on her chest. As her apartment building came into view, the terrible humming in her ears that she'd been experiencing since rushing out of Mr. Santos's house seemed to get louder. It stood there, warm and welcoming, promising security and protection, and all Liv could think about was whether the locks would hold. Against what, specifically? "You've gone insane. You're walking down the street alone." Was she, however, truly alone? She wiped her brow with the back of her left hand after feeling something drip down her brow. The bloodied hand washed away, and she wondered for the first time that evening whether it was her blood or someone else's. The thick globs of drying blood on her hands stood out against her dark skin, creating a stark contrast. Without a doubt, she realized that with her hands covered in blood she would have only spread whatever was on her brow. Everything seemed so far away now. When he called, she dashed into her boss's house, his breath ragged and his words jumbled. He was discovered on the floor of his massive library, gargling his last breaths. Libby's chin trembled as she remembered collapsing next to him and helplessly attempting to assist when it was clearly too late. He had told her not to call an ambulance. She did it, regardless. It never came. She pushed through the glass doors into the foyer and dashed to the elevators, expecting a hand to reach out and grab her. Libby took a deep breath as the doors closed in front of her, and the foyer was still devoid of any living beings, only bathed in warm orange lights. As the key slipped soundly into the lock and the tumblers undid themselves with an encouraging clink, Libby let out the breath she had seemed to be holding since entering the building. Her house was right around the corner. Her spacious couch, flat-screen TV, and kitchenette. Her bedroom door remained open, exactly as she'd left it. All she could think about was going inside her bathroom and soak in the bathtub. But she knew she couldn't do it. She sprinted into the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and flee. She was unable to stop. No, not right now. As she was about to walk through the door, strong hand clamped over her mouth, and violently pulled her back. It was so hard, she couldn't even bring herself to scream. His Baby to Bear, Chapter 2. Movement in the bedroom, Tim said. The earpiece in Jerome's ear making an irritating buzzing sound in addition to the information. Movement in the left stairwell, Mitch added. His team was dispersed, with everyone holding their positions while he was tasked with the actual pursuit. He was well aware that he wasn't the only one who had backup. Something about professional jobs smelled bad and could punch you in the face from a mile away. That's probably why the woman was so alarmed it was too obvious to ignore. With a hissing snarl, Jerome turned around on his heel and charged down the other side of the building. His heart rate increased, and he knew his muscles would begin to prepare for the impending fight or flight. He couldn't see anything except for the gray, fluorescent walls of the right-side stairwell leading up. His steps had become heavy and hurried, rather than silent. Jerome accelerated on the 5th floor faster than any other man. That's what 10 years in the army does to a man. It didn't hurt that he was a werebear capable of outrunning most top-tier sprinters. When he opened the door to the corridor, a low growl thrummed on his throat, as the stench hit him square in the face. Wolves. Those fucking wild dogs were always the culprits. He'd never been inside that building, but he knew his way around like the back of his hand. A left turn, a straight, narrow corridor, the elevators and her apartment, were all ahead of him. The woman's apartment has 2 adjoining rooms. She preferred the color lavender and her house was always immaculate. And she was in so much jeopardy, that it took his squad to save her. As he pounded down the corridor, the carpets on the floors softened his steps, his black pants, combat boots, and long-sleeved t-shirt making him look like something out of a bad action movie, in an upper-class apartment building. "Lieutenant, they're on the 4th floor. You don't have much time," Mitch said, his voice tensed. Jerome cracked a grin. Close calls. He completely loved them. His sure-footed step swayed for a moment as he rounded the corner and caught a whiff of her scent. He stumbled slightly, narrowly avoiding a faceplant into the wall. He swallowed the growl, which was a reaction to her scent. She smelled like... well, she smelled like heaven. "Get over your fucking self," he snarled mentally. Then she appeared in front of us. At the same time, a second ping rang in his ear. They've made it to the 5th. Not just the apartment, but all over the house. She's walked up the front door. Get the fuck out. Tim's voice was a little tinny in his ear. He didn't have to repeat himself. From afar, he took in the mouth-watering shape of the woman he was about to rescue. Her swollen breasts, the attractive curve of her wide hips, and that white chocolate skin that begged to be licked. Jerome caught a glimpse of her soft, ruby lips, which he had admired while they were watching Santos's house. But something about seeing her through the binoculars and then in person, threw him for a loop. However, reflexes and training kicked in when his brain desired to take a moment to truly appreciate the beautiful creature that fate had brought him. He slammed his hand over her mouth, squeezing so tightly that even if she screamed, it would be muffled yelps at best. She instinctively snatched his arm. His body reacted immediately. A burst of heat shot through him, claiming him with the ferocity of a bullet to the chest. He felt as if someone had knocked the wind out of him. But his body kept working. His legs continued to move. Jerome nearly dragged her backward, angling her back the word where he'd come from and pushing her along the well-lit, bright corridor. "I'm here to help you. Move or we'll both die," he hissed in her ear. He had an inexplicable desire to bite and lick at that delicate part of her. Her hazel eyes sparkled with gold thread as she looked up at him, wide with fear. He didn't slow down, and she kept moving and running alongside him. He couldn't tell what they were, but he did notice that they could only run in one direction. And those fucking wolves will be aware of it. Jerome tentatively took his hand away from her mouth, missing the sensation of her warm breath against his skin, and she gave a tiny little nod. He let go of her mouth and grabbed her hand, dragging her along him. His other hand grabbed one of his gun that was secured on his hips. The yelling grew louder, and at least 3 pairs of combat boots slammed down the corridor, in addition to his own. "Fuck. Do everything I tell you," he said, giving her a quick glance. Her face was splattered with blood, and her hand that was warm in his, still drenched in her boss's lifeblood. Despite her best efforts to keep up with him, she was visibly shaking. It broke his heart to see her like that, eyes sunken and body straining to keep up with everything she'd seen and done that night. He'd make damn sure she will never be hurt again. He would have paused to consider how fucking ridiculous that sounded at any other time, but not now. He didn't have a choice but to protect her. Whatever happens, whatever happens. He muttered something under his breath as he kicked the door shut behind them. There was a plan for a plan. A contingency after contingency. But these thugs were depleting his arsenal at a breakneck pace. The announcement from Tom, Tim's twin, rang in his ringing head at the same time. He heard another set of footsteps rush up the stairs. "There's a movement in the other stairwell. Suggest moving to the roof." "No shit," he hissed under his breath as half-pulled, half-carried his dark-haired goddess up the 10th floor steps. "What?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't say anything. There was no time for small talk. There was no time to enjoy the absolutely vexing tingle her touch sent through him. There was no time to ponder how he knew what this sensation was or what it meant. There isn't time to stare at her and try to remember every single detail of her face. No, there was only so much time in the day. His baby to bear, Chapter 3. Jerome had no idea what her name was, since it wasn't necessary for the mission. His team was, of course, aware. They'd scouted every possible player, and she'd been near the top of the list. But all he knew was, she was the right girl at the wrong time and at the wrong place. And she was now in deeper muck than she could ever hope to dig herself out of. They were on the verge of falling through an unlocked door leading to the roof, which was common in these kind of buildings. There was no fire escape that high up, but one started a few stories down. Ropes and harnesses were piled in a secluded corner, ready for Jerome and his package. Get on board with that, honey. Reduce your height. Don't bother taking a look up. Don't bother showing up. If they get past me, jump off the ledge on the route's left side. There must be a fire exit somewhere down there. My team will get you on the ground as soon as possible. Don't look back. He yelled, his light brown eyes boring into hers as he pointed to the large air ducts in the middle of the roof. Several pairs of combat boots could be heard pounding up the steps, so close he could almost taste them. And there she was, staring at him like an angel thrown into a situation she wasn't supposed to be in. Hesitant, afraid, but there was a fire in her eyes that made him lick his lips. Not right fucking now. Focus. The party was about to get started. Libby's point of view. Her breath was stuck in her throat, just like it had been when she was running toward her house, the one place she was supposed to be safe. Adrenaline and heat were coursing through her veins, blinding and deafening her while also alerting her to her surroundings. Libby's legs ached. Her hands trembled like those of a drug addict who had gone too long without a dose. Her throat was parched, and her lungs were cursing her for flying up the stairs. She was now crouching behind an air vent, the constant, loud hum of air rushing through it drowning out everything else. What's the point of doing whatever he tells you to do? Maybe he's the fucking psycho who killed Jimmy. Perhaps those other guys are here to help. A hail of gunfire blew open the door at that exact moment. She yelped and ducked lower, clutching her head with both hands. Her fingers dug into her loose curls, and she tasted the bitter taste of dread that she'd felt when that big guy grabbed her earlier. He dragged her right off her doorstep, but she noticed guys starting to pile out of there from the corner of her eye, and none of them seemed too happy to see her go. She was perplexed as hell, but her primal desire to live came roaring back with a vengeance. Because the gunfire was so loud, she imagined that every cop car in the city would be heading there. They would, wouldn't they? Shots were heard late at night on the south side. She'd be lucky if a patrol car came to inspect the apartment. Even so, what could they possibly do against the obvious arsenal that these guys were carrying? Libby bit her lower lip to prevent herself from crying. It was all a little too much. Finding Jimmy dying and telling her that she needed to flee because someone was after her. He drew her face closer to his, pressing down so hard on the back of her neck that it hurt. He refused to tell her why she had to flee, choking from his own blood from the deep puncture wound to his chest. The only thing that mattered was that she did. He wouldn't let go of her until he breathed his last breath and died. Then she returned home to find a veritable army prepared to do to her what she had assumed they did to Jimmy. Above her head, there was now a gunfire fight. There were too many unanswered questions for her to attempt to make sense of anything, and her mind raced to keep up. Her cream coat was covered with blood, and she'd crouched into a small ball to peer out the side of the air vent. Her feet were mostly darting to the sides, looking for a better vantage point to shoot at her nameless savior. They were all dressed in black, with harsh expressions and angular lines in their faces, as they backed up a little further to get out of the direct line of fire. such as the type of men you could hire in a group to do your bidding. All of them are nearly interchangeable. The big guy, as she referred to him in her head, wasn't going to stand a chance. One of the men were carrying an assault rifle, for God's sake. I am just a mere assistant. How did I end up being a part of this? Panic roiled around the edges of her mind, but she kept it at bay. She'd have plenty of time to go insane later. As she peered out a little further, she could see the occasional shot fired from the other side of the little outcrop, muzzle flashes blinding her in the otherwise solid darkness of the night. The shots echoed through her body, choking her with numbing fear. I hope he kills every single one of them. Please hit like, subscribe and notification bell to get updates.